What makes soil?
It's the organic fraction. It's that it's a living being. You've got to have life, and where there's evidence of life, there's going to be organic matter. So that's really the distinguishing characteristic, and that's what's the distinguishing characteristics that's missing in a lot of these paleosoils. Whereas for soil scientists, we find these fossil soils very obviously by the organic layer, by the organic matter. So.
Glenn, just to throw some more in, I remember when you first came to visit us in Jurassic Ark, I asked you what you thought was one of the best evidences for Noah's flood, and you said the absence of the soil layers. And of course, I'd never done much thinking about that except in the context of coal, but it's true of coal and it's true of the majority of the fossil record. Yes. So good point. But going one step further, you arrived at Jurassic Ark. Do you remember what year it was?
2019.
That's right, just before some of the big floods up north and things like that. So, yeah. But one of the things that we wouldn't have stressed at that time that Diane and I particularly struggled over, much of the area at Jurassic Ark had been cleared during the gold mining periods in Gympie, which is the 1780s, 90s, etc., right up to World War I, and still occurring today. They don't use the local native forest for mine props or anything anymore, but then the regrowth of the trees, etc., was hindered by the fact that in the time the mining had occurred, the soil is depleted. The one thing that's very obvious, given any time of exposure at all, is the loss of soil, particularly if there's no vegetation already on it. But we had to struggle because, Diane, you might remember, we cleared the whole area. We sort of got the soil from where we dug up the fossils and spread it around, and we put plants in and grew nothing, right? It was very evident that soil was more than just minerals and particles of stuff dumped on a bed with seeds planted into it. So we struggled for years. We got the best fertilizer, we got water, we actually got the best plants, right? You know, we paid the most for the seeds, etc., and really achieved very little. Until, Diane, we actually added some things to the soil. Do you remember what we added?
Well, we brought in tons and tons of mulch, and then we added worms.
That's it. We added the living bit. So if you thought Glenn was sort of over the moon when he said it's a living substance, we really had to add stuff that had been alive. It cost us a small fortune to reactivate the minerals that were obviously available. We had a moderate percentage clay sand, so the clay was full of minerals, but they weren't accessible under normal circumstances. And then we added mulch, and things grew a little bit better, but not much. And then we added worms. And by worms, I mean we had a few giant earthworms that we discovered living in the forest that was still a forest about a kilometre away. And boy, once we added worms, what happened, Diane?
Oh, it just transformed it completely. The plants started to grow and flourish, even though they were getting the same water and growing in the same mineral content, yes.
Yeah. And we never had to add any more fertilizer. The worms did it for us, going round and round and round. And we could tell we were succeeding because now we can dig up the soil and you find handfuls of worms. The soil is biologically active. Hence, Glenn, you've actually poured plastic down, some sort of stuff down wormholes, haven't you? Or ant holes. What did you do that for?
Yeah, the ant holes, that was melted aluminum, but we did a lot of dye staining of them, and we did do other types of, trying to fossilize essentially and recreate the actual paths. But most of it was dye staining because we were interested in preferential flow. We weren't interested as characterizing the pore as much as just being able to track its flow paths until I started work on piping. Yes. Yeah.
So therefore, I hope you gave 3 days notice to the ants you were going to pour molten aluminium.
You can see them in the metal. You can see them.
But Diane, just to stress this, some of the things you've worked on, the bio cycles that are occurring in the soil. So apart from worms, what else I mean, if we were adding mulch, what was one of the living things in the mulch that was actually being added by us unconsciously?
Well, there are lots of microbes and also fungi. So, in fact, it's a whole ecosystem, and it had to be all there for it to really flourish, where you've got interaction between the microscopic and the macroscopic, the things that you can see. And it's alive and functioning. As Glenn said, soil is something that is actually living, and it's a whole ecosystem of small microscopic organisms, things that you can just see like fungi, and things that you can easily see like worms. And we have some big ones in Australia, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
And usually I was going to say, usually after a mine, you've got to get the pH right. That's the first thing. It's because they're usually acidic. But it's amazing to me how quickly the land reestablishes, not just at Mount St. Helens. In our area that we lived in North Mississippi, it was called the Badlands. It looked just like the Badlands in South Carolina. It was just gullied. It was after the Civil War, everything went into cotton production, and that's a very erosive system, and just stripped the land out, and it was just gullied. So in the 1930s, they started taking land out of agriculture and putting it into trees. Within 30 years, it was just completely vegetated. It's just amazing how quickly. I wanted to show you one other thing.
Sure.
So this is what I studied with soil pipes. And so this is a naturally formed soil pipe, because as water moves in these perched water tables to the opening through the soil, the iron precipitates out, and sometimes you'll get it to stabilize the ground around the pipe. So just a little interesting artifact.
It is. One last comment from me before we take the next question, Sam, and that is our guy who's missing today, Craig. He's actually leading a field trip up into the interior of Tasmania looking for trilobites. Remember the trilobites we showed you, the name invented in 1771 by a Christian creationist, a believer in Noah's flood. Did they tell you that in your geology course? They leave the real history out so they can give you the impression we thought all of this up all by ourselves, starting from zilch, which is rubbish. We started with a Christian belief that God had created, that he'd put law and order, and even in the fossils, if it looked like a shark's teeth, it was a shark's teeth. Well, Craig has been a forester for a long time, and he's let us in on a few little secrets, because one of our failures at Jurassic Ark has surprisingly been with our native gum trees. We thought since they were native, we could just bring them. We got specimens from all over the planet, all over Australia, and planted them. And I'll tell you what, the biggest disaster followed, as most of them struggled and some of them died. So we brought in our chief forester from Tasmania and said, what are we doing wrong? And he said, well, here's what we found. If you have gum trees and you clear the forest, then the rest of the bugs that depend on that gum tree, within a few years, they'll die out too. And so if you want to replant gum trees, you have to replant all the bugs, the bacteria, the fungi, he said, because if you don't plant all three at once, you get none of the above living. So soil is, as Glenn said, an active, living thing that produces a very distinct level, and it's the thing that really is. I vouch for that. I've been much of the planet. I vouch it's missing from the majority of the fossil record, and that is a killer. Great thought, Glenn.